The year was 1944. Across a war-torn Europe drenched in smoke and uncertainty, millions struggled to survive another day. Cities lay shattered, farmlands burned to ash, and hunger stalked civilians and soldiers alike like a silent, merciless predator. For German women serving in auxiliary military roles, many now prisoners of the rapidly advancing Allied forces, food had become more memory than reality. Thin soups, hard bread, and weeks of monotony had dulled the senses, leaving the taste buds as exhausted as the spirit. But on a quiet afternoon inside a secure American POW camp, everything changed. The women, escorted past rows of wooden barracks and watchtowers silhouetted against the winter light, stepped into a large mess hall humming with activity. Steam drifted upward from metal trays. The smell of fresh bread, roasted meat, and vegetables filled the air, so rich, so unfamiliar, that some prisoners instinctively slowed their steps, wondering if their eyes were deceiving them. Inside, the long wooden tables looked nothing like the starved Europe they had known. Every inch seemed covered with something. Bowls of potatoes seasoned with herbs, bread rolls warm enough to fog the fingertips, jellies, jams, butter, fresh fruit, luxuries unimaginable in Germany's collapsing home front. Even desserts, pies cut into perfect slices, their aromas drifting like a forgotten dream. Many of the women stood frozen in place, unsure whether this abundance was real or some strange illusion conjured by their hunger. But the American guards simply nodded, signaling for them to sit, to eat, to recover. In that moment, the war outside seemed impossibly distant, and for the first time in months many of them felt human again. The German female POWs had been marched across many campyards before, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them inside the American mess hall that afternoon. The moment they approached the building, they sensed something different, something that didn't match the harsh routines they had grown used to. Instead of the stern silence of a military barracks or the cold detachment of a temporary holding area, there was warmth in the air. The structure itself wasn't extraordinary, a long wooden hall with windows streaked by winter light, its exterior battered by time and weather. But inside, something entirely unexpected stirred. The women pushed open the heavy door, and a wave of warm air rolled over them like a gentle tide. For a brief moment, they simply stood at the entrance, blinking as their eyes adjusted to the glow of overhead lamps. They had expected dimness, ration lines, perhaps a table with a single pot of thin soup. After all, this was wartime. Resources were stretched thin everywhere. Even back home, their own country had long abandoned the luxury of choice. Food had become mathematical. Calories, survival, nothing more. But here, inside this hall under American control, the world felt upside down. The first thing they noticed was the noise, not harsh, but soft, almost comforting. The clang of metal utensils against trays, the hum of guards speaking casually, the shuffle of boots on a clean floor. It didn't sound like a prison. It didn't sound like war. It sounded normal, ordinary. Something many of these women had forgotten the sound of. Steam drifted upward from rows of food stations, catching the light and forming pale ribbons that curled toward the ceiling. The women instinctively straightened their backs, not from discipline, but from sheer disbelief. Their nostrils flared as unfamiliar smells reached them, rich aromas of seasoned potatoes, roasted meats, cooked vegetables, and something sweet they couldn't identify at first. Their senses, dulled by months of scarcity, seemed to awaken all at once. For some, the sudden return of scent was almost overwhelming, as if their bodies were unsure how to process something so abundant. The American guards standing near the food counters offered brief nods, not smiles, not warmth, but acknowledgement. Permission. An unspoken message. You may approach, you may eat, you are not here to starve. Still, the women hesitated. They exchanged glances, searching one another's faces for confirmation that this wasn't a trap or a misunderstanding. Many had been fed propaganda for years, stories describing Americans as cruel, barbaric, merciless. Stories of mistreatment, humiliation, and brutality. This abundance didn't fit those stories. It contradicted everything they had been taught. One of the younger POWs, barely 20 and still carrying the hollow-eyed exhaustion of long marches, took a tentative step forward. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, and she froze. A guard nodded once more deliberately this time, signaling her to keep moving. She inhaled deeply, her first deep breath in days, and ventured further inside. The others followed, some slowly, some almost mechanically, as if afraid that too quick a movement might cause the entire scene to dissolve like a mirage. When they finally reached the serving tables, the sight became even more surreal. There were not one or two trays of food. There were dozens. Different textures, colors, shapes. American potatoes seasoned with herbs. Actual herbs, the kind many had not tasted since before the war. Bread rolls that were soft enough to be pressed between the fingers. Metal trays of steaming vegetables, bright greens and oranges standing in stark contrast to the grey monotony of their recent meals. Cuts of meat carved into even slices, pitchers of water so clear it looked almost luminous under the lamps. And then there were the items that felt almost mythical: jellies, jams, butter, fruits. Fruit. One woman paused in front of a bowl of apples, staring at them as though they were artifacts from a lost world. Her home city had been cut off by bombings. She hadn't seen fruit in months. Another prisoner hovered near the bread station, her fingertips brushing lightly against a warm roll, then recoiling, unsure if she was allowed to touch something so soft, so fresh. The Americans didn't rush them. They didn't bark orders. They simply watched, waiting for the women to realize that the food was not restricted to certain ranks, not reserved for interrogations or incentives. It was simply there. For them. For everyone. It felt impossible. One POW, older and hardened by years of service in auxiliary roles near the front, whispered something under her breath. Her voice trembled. She said it felt wrong, not in a negative way, but in a way that struck the heart. Wrong that she should be eating like this while her family back home was likely struggling to survive. Wrong that the enemy, an enemy she had been told was monstrous, was offering her a plate overflowing with options. But beneath that conflict was something deeper, a quiet, cautious gratitude. As trays were handed out, the women moved as though underwater, slow, tentative. Each step taken with the disbelief of someone walking into an impossible memory. The hall grew warmer by the minute, not because of the temperature, but because of the atmosphere. The air no longer felt foreign, it felt strangely human, almost painfully normal. They reached the serving line and stood before American cooks wearing aprons, their sleeves rolled, their faces focused on their tasks. The cooks didn't glare, they didn't smirk, they didn't survey the prisoners with malice or superiority. They simply scooped portions generously, as if feeding soldiers after a long march. One cook even nudged the serving spoon deeper into the tray to pick up the more flavorful pieces at the bottom. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. When the first German woman received her full tray, she froze again, staring down at the meal. The contrast was staggering. On one single tray was more variety than she had seen in weeks. Months for some. She slowly stepped aside to make room for the next woman, but her gaze remained fixed on the food, her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, from disbelief. At the tables, the atmosphere shifted even more. The women lowered themselves onto wooden benches, the weight of exhaustion settling into their bones. Yet something else settled too. Curiosity. Shock. A strange sense of comfort they didn't yet trust enough to feel openly. The mess hall, once just a building, now became a moment suspended in time. A pocket of warmth inside a world frozen by conflict. A space where reality contradicted expectation so completely that the POWs could hardly comprehend it. Some leaned close to one another and whispered, asking if this was normal for American camps. Others shook their heads, unable to form explanations. A few simply stared forward, eyes glazed with confusion, adjusting to a reality that felt kinder than anything they had anticipated. It wasn't that they suddenly felt safe. No prisoner feels safe. It wasn't that they forgot the war outside. No one could forget. It was simply that the moment was human. Disarmingly human. And that alone was enough to shake them more than any battlefield ever had. They had stepped inside expecting rations, expecting discipline, deprivation, cold efficiency. What they found instead was abundance, an abundance they could not understand, could not reconcile, could not ignore. And as they lifted their trays and settled into their first bites, one truth lingered in the back of every mind. This was not how enemies were supposed to treat each other. This was something else entirely. The moment the German female POWs sat down at the long wooden tables, something shifted, something invisible, something emotional, something powerful enough to silence even the constant hum of wartime fear that had lived inside them for months. The benches creaked softly under their weight, and the mess hall lights cast a warm glow across their faces. Yet none of them reached for their utensils right away. Instead, they sat still, staring at the food before them as if it were a delicate artifact that might vanish if they moved too quickly. For so long, eating had been mechanical, an act done out of necessity, stripped of pleasure, stripped of memory. But now, confronted by real food, the senses they had pushed to sleep began to awaken slowly, cautiously, painfully. Some women reached up and touched their faces, unsure how to respond to the flood of emotion rising unexpectedly inside them. The first bite was not a bite at all. It was a moment of hesitation, a pause filled with 1,000 silent thoughts. Is this really for us? Is this allowed? Is this safe? Is this real? When one woman finally lifted a forkful of potatoes to her lips, she did it with the deliberate slowness of someone afraid of waking from a dream. The potatoes, still steaming, carried the scent of herbs she hadn't smelled in years, the kind her mother used to sprinkle over Sunday meals before the war reshaped every aspect of life. As the first taste hit her tongue, her breath caught in her throat. She froze, fork still raised, her eyes widening, not in fear, but in disbelief. The flavor was too much, too rich, too warm. Her mouth, accustomed to thin soups and cold bread, struggled to adjust to the sensation. Then it happened. Her eyes glistened, not with sorrow, not with homesickness, but with a release. Like something inside her chest cracked open, allowing feelings she didn't even know were buried to rise to the surface. She blinked quickly, ashamed to show emotion in a room filled with strangers and guards, but she couldn't stop the tear that slipped down her cheek. She wasn't alone. Across the table, a woman in her 30s, once confident, once proud, lifted a piece of bread to her lips. She inhaled its warm, yeasty aroma before taking a bite, and in that moment she was no longer a prisoner. She was a daughter sitting in her family kitchen on a snowy winter evening, slicing bread with her father as her mother stirred a pot of stew. For a brief, fragile instant, the war dissolved around her, replaced by a memory so vivid she could almost hear the crackle of the home fireplace. She stopped chewing and covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed. Her shoulders shook once, a tremor she tried desperately to hide, but the emotion was too real, too raw. She set the bread down gently, as though it were precious porcelain. Others tried to compose themselves, focusing on the food with a seriousness that bordered on reverence. They ate slowly, almost ritualistically, testing each flavor, confirming to themselves that what they tasted was genuine. Every bite reminded them of something, of the past, of home, of life before the war had stripped away every comfort. Some women weren't just moved emotionally. They were confused by the sensation of fullness creeping into their bodies. Hunger had been a constant companion, predictable, familiar, endless. Now, just a few bites in, their stomachs rebelled, unsure what to do with food dense in calories and flavor. A few paused to take deep breaths, their bodies trembling as they adjusted to warmth spreading from the inside out. With each bite, they remembered what it felt like to be human. Not soldiers, not prisoners, not political symbols, but human. One POW pushed her bowl of stew slightly away from herself and closed her eyes. She had felt tears gathering long before the first bite, but she had held them in. Now, with warmth radiating through her fingers, she allowed herself a quiet moment to breathe. The stew tasted almost exactly like the one her grandmother used to make, a memory so distant she had assumed it was lost forever, buried under years of hardship and fear. She wasn't thinking about the Allies. She wasn't thinking about the war. She wasn't thinking about captivity. She was thinking about a small farmhouse, about laughter drifting from the kitchen doorway, about a life that once felt safe. It wasn't the food alone that was moving them. It was what the food represented: choice, abundance, normalcy, stability, human dignity. Back home, everything had collapsed. Bomb sirens, rubble-filled streets, shrinking rations, propaganda speeches promising victories no one believed anymore. Food had become a daily reminder of loss. But here, in a camp run by the very enemy they were told to fear, food became a reminder of something else entirely: possibility. For the first time in many months, they were not being treated like tools of war or burdens of defeat. They were being fed well, not out of generosity or ideology, but because it was policy, because it was expected, because it was the human thing to do. One of the older women, known among the group for her stoicism, gripped her fork tightly. Her knuckles whitened. She stared down at her tray, her lips pressed together in a trembling line. She had lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front. She had endured air raids so frequent that even now she flinched at loud noises. She had watched her family ration every crumb. And yet here, far from home, far from everything familiar, she was being served a meal more generous than anything she had eaten in years. She whispered a single word: Warren. Why? Not angrily, not resentfully, but with genuine bewilderment. Why would their enemy give them comfort? Why would their captors offer them food with variety, warmth, and dignity? Why did this room feel more humane than the chaos she had lived through for the last 2 years? The woman beside her gently touched her arm and shook her head, unable to answer. because there was no answer, at least not one that made sense to minds trained by propaganda and hardened by survival. The Americans ran their POW camps by strict regulations. Food variety was not kindness, it was order. It was structure. Yet to these women, everything felt personal, emotional, transformative. Many of them had not tasted sweetness in months. When one of the prisoners dipped her spoon into a serving of jam, she paused. The color was bright, too bright. The texture glossy. She touched it with her tongue, and an explosion of sugar spread across her mouth. Her eyes widened, then fluttered shut. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The expression on her face was enough to tell her story's sweetness had returned to her world, if only for a moment. Not every woman reacted openly. Some hid their emotions behind rigid posture, refusing to show vulnerability in front of guards or peers. But even behind those stoic eyes, something was shifting, something profound. Their breaths became deeper. Their shoulders loosened. Their eyes softened. A sense of safety, small, tentative, fragile, crept into their awareness. For months, they had lived with the tension of war tightening around them like a steel band. Now, that band loosened just slightly, replaced by something warmer, something gentler, something they didn't dare name. They didn't trust the moment fully, not yet, but they felt it. And that alone was enough to change them. The food was more than nourishment. It was a memory, a reminder, a lifeline connecting them to the pieces of themselves the war had not managed to destroy. This meal did not erase their suffering. It did not absolve the past. But it did something far more human. It allowed them to feel again, to feel warmth, to feel comfort, to feel hope, however small, to feel the quiet, undeniable truth that even in captivity dignity had not been taken from them. As they continued eating, the room grew quieter, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They were not just consuming a meal. They were consuming a moment they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. A moment that reminded them they were still alive. A moment that spoke louder than any speech, any order, any ideology. Food had become a message they understood deeply, instinctively, entirely. You are human, you matter, you can breathe again. By the time the meal had drawn to a close, a quiet transformation had swept through the mess hall, subtle but undeniable. The German female POWs, who had arrived moments before with eyes wide in disbelief, now moved with a tentative ease, their initial shock replaced by a sense of calm they had not felt in months. The long wooden tables, once intimidating in their expanse and filled with food so abundant it seemed impossible, now seemed like a space of refuge. The clatter of utensils and the hum of casual conversation between American guards and cooks had become part of the background. A gentle rhythm, almost soothing, like a heartbeat returning to normal after a long period of strain. As the women pushed their trays aside and leaned back, a quiet understanding passed between them, wordless but potent. The world inside these walls was nothing like the world they had been trained to expect. For many, the simple act of finishing a meal had become a revelation. Their bodies, starved for months or even years, felt the unfamiliar sensation of satiety, not as burden but as liberation. It was as if the warmth of food and the glow of the room had seeped into their very bones, reminding them of something long forgotten. The pleasure of nourishment, the comfort of abundance, the idea that life could still offer small, tangible joys even in the shadow of war. Some women lingered over the final bites, hesitant to let the experience end, reluctant to leave the space where, for the first time in so long, they felt fully present, fully human. Each chew, each swallow, became an act of quiet defiance against the months of deprivation, a subtle reclaiming of dignity. The emotional impact went beyond their individual experiences. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere in the hall shifted collectively. Conversation began to ripple gently through the tables, first in hesitant whispers, and then in low laughter. For a moment, the rigid hierarchy of captor and captive softened, replaced by a fragile bridge of shared humanity. The American guards, initially distant and formal, began to be perceived differently, not merely as wardens of captivity, but as facilitators of this unexpected normalcy. Their presence, once a reminder of the POWs' limitations and the world of rules and restrictions, now became a symbol of structure that allowed kindness to flourish. The women noticed gestures that had previously gone unremarked. The careful arrangement of dishes, the warmth emanating from fresh food, the patience extended by cooks as portions were distributed generously. It was a stark contrast to the environment they had endured in Germany, where rations were minimal, scarcity pervasive, and sustenance a constant reminder of loss and struggle. This simple shift, seeing the enemy act with order, care, and consistency, sparked a profound reassessment of what they had been taught. For years, propaganda had painted the Allies in shades of cruelty, denying the possibility of humane behavior. Yet here, in a controlled, orderly camp, the women were confronted with a different reality. They realized that kindness could exist even amid conflict, and that humanity was not confined to one side or another. The meal had delivered more than calories. It had delivered a message: quiet yet unmistakable dignity can persist even in captivity, and acts of consideration can ripple through even the most hostile circumstances, altering perceptions and softening hardened hearts. The physical surroundings of the hall reinforced this unexpected lesson. Long rows of benches and tables, meticulously arranged, allowed each woman personal space while fostering a sense of shared community. The wooden surfaces gleamed under the soft illumination, the steam rising from the food casting golden ribbons in the light. Outside, the winter sunlight filtered through the windows, highlighting the orderly camp beyond, creating a visual contrast with the chaos of the war-torn landscapes they had left behind. For a fleeting moment, the POWs could imagine that this structured, well-maintained environment was the norm, that life could be orderly, that safety and nourishment could coexist, even in a world defined by destruction. The meal had become a catalyst for imagination, a rare and precious experience for minds conditioned to survive, not to dream. As the women finished the final bites and pushed back from the tables, their posture had changed subtly but unmistakably. Shoulders that had been hunched with tension now lifted slightly. Faces that had been etched with exhaustion and weariness bore softer expressions. There was a sense of relief, yes, but also of empowerment. The realization that they could experience comfort, that they could engage with life beyond mere survival. Conversations, once stifled by fear and suspicion, began to flow in soft murmurs, sharing small observations and quiet laughter. A woman described the sweetness of a piece of fruit, another commented on the softness of a bread roll, and the mood of the hall shifted from one of imposed stillness to shared engagement. Even fleeting moments of eye contact conveyed mutual understanding. They had been seen, acknowledged, and treated as human beings rather than mere captives. In that sense, the meal became a transformative event, a memory that would endure far longer than the war itself. For the American personnel observing these changes, the reactions may have seemed modest, even mundane, Yet for the women themselves, they were monumental. Each bite, each glance, each small conversation contributed to a deeper understanding that life inside captivity could contain pockets of normalcy and care. The structured abundance, offered without expectation or judgment, challenged every preconceived notion the POWs had carried, that enemies were unfeeling, that suffering was universal, that survival required the sacrifice of humanity. Instead, they experienced a reality where rules, organization, and discipline intersected with compassion, a reality in which dignity could be preserved even within the constraints of a camp. By the time the meal concluded, the hall had been transformed in their minds. It was no longer merely a place for sustenance. It had become a space of introspection, reflection, and quiet revelation. The food, once a simple necessity, now carried symbolic weight. It was a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, small acts of care could resonate deeply. For many of the women, it would be impossible to separate the taste of a fresh, well-prepared meal from the memory of feeling seen, valued, and acknowledged. The encounter had shifted their understanding of captivity, subtly but irrevocably, introducing the notion that the human spirit could be nourished even in confinement. This realization, like the warmth of the meal itself, would linger, shaping their thoughts and memories long after the mess hall emptied. As the POWs rose from the tables and made their way back to their quarters, the effect of the meal persisted. Their steps were lighter, their eyes less guarded, and a sense of hope, small, fragile, yet undeniably present, followed them down the corridors. The meal had not erased the hardships of war, nor had it undone the suffering they had endured, but it had provided a moment of clarity, a glimpse into a world where nourishment, humanity, and respect were not mutually exclusive. In that space, for that brief interlude, they experienced a form of liberation. The liberation of dignity restored, the liberation of the spirit recognized, the liberation of understanding that kindness could exist even in a time defined by conflict. That day in the mess hall would remain etched in memory for the rest of their lives. Not for the names of dishes or the novelty of ingredients, but for the profound emotional resonance of being treated with care, for the subtle recognition of their humanity, and for the quiet, transformative power of experiencing a moment where war's cruelty was temporarily suspended by the simple, extraordinary act of being fed well. It was a lesson far larger than the walls of the hall that empathy, order, and human decency could penetrate even the darkest years of history, and that a single meal could alter perception, touch hearts, and inspire a fragile but enduring hope for the world beyond captivity.